Hi everyone, thanks for coming out today. Just to give you a little bit of context, Opbeat is an ops platform for developers, and this talk is going to be about the experience that we've kind of gained building Opbeat over the years and other web applications. So hopefully this advice that I'm going to be doling out over the next couple of minutes will help you ship more and sleep more, which as developers, that's probably our ultimate goals. So it used to be that you had a big ops department and a big development department, and every time the development department finished some code, they would throw it over the imaginary wall to the ops department. And that's not really a good way to work. You end up in situations where developers finish some code, they give it to the ops department, and then they stop caring about it. And the problem here is twofold. So the developers write code, they give it to the ops department, and then when something breaks, the ops department gets paged. And then after they get paged, they need to fix the code. So there's two problems, and it's basically about accountability. If you as a developer write code and you know that somebody else is going to be woken up in the middle of the night because of a mistake you did, you're going to write less good code. Also, the ops department didn't write your code, so they are not really in a position to fix it when it's broken. So what we started doing really early on in Opbeat is that we have this rule that is, if you build it, then you ship it. And that's important because what typically happens when you ship new code, something breaks. And if somebody else shipped it, then you're not around to fix it when it breaks. So if you build it, you ship it. And then after you've shipped it, you fix it when it's broken. So this is a way to increase accountability in the team. You build it, you ship it, you fix it. And then your organization looks more like this. So today, you've typically outsourced most of the hardcore operations, stuff like making sure that the servers have power, that they have internet, that you have enough servers, that the data center is connected, etc. All this stuff, you typically outsourced it to companies like DigitalOcean, for example. And then your developers are left with doing what we call web operations, which means making sure that the code they write actually works when it gets put into production. So this is nice. This is a good way to work. But then when something breaks, your typical questions are, what happened? What changed? And who changed it? Who can fix it? And when did this change? A way to answer these questions is to increase transparency in your team. And one of the ways you can do that is by making use of better tooling. So I'm going to show you some examples of tooling. This is a screenshot from Opbeat. And so one of the things we help your team do is track exceptions that occur. And this is an exception that occurred. You can see that this is a stack frame. So you can see where the exception happened. But you can also see who wrote the code that's now breaking. That's pretty useful because he's probably the person who wrote the code is probably the one who knows best how to fix it. You can also see when the code went into production, and that's also useful to figure out if that correlates with the errors you're seeing now. Here's another screenshot. This is a screenshot from our chat room, from our Slack room, and we've integrated Circle CI with Slack. So every time somebody breaks the build today, everybody on the team can see it. What happened here was that Benny broke the build, and Mania tells him to do push-ups. And that's just another way for the team to kind of keep track of what's going on, who's working on what, and how's that going. Here's another screenshot. This is from a tool called New Relic, which is very useful to figure out how your web application is performing currently. We use New Relic, and it's actually pretty good. It's pretty expensive, but it's a good tool. Here is yet another screenshot. This is also from our Slack room, from our chat room, and this is Opbeat notifying everybody on the team that a new release has been pushed out. Another good way to keep track of who pushes what to production. Okay, now I want to talk about small incremental releases. This is also something that we've learned the hard way in Opbeat. And we find ourselves in pain every time we deviate from this concept. You should ship small incremental releases. And you should ship small incremental releases because it's much easier to analyze the impact of a small release. It's much easier to roll back a small release. There's going to be more parallelism on the team because people are going to be waiting for each other less when you ship small releases. And shipping feels good. If you ship more, you feel good more. So those are reasons you should ship small releases. Here are more reasons. When you are shipping a small release, there's less code to write, there's less code to review, and testing the changes is faster because the scope is smaller. And this is a tweet which I think is pretty accurate. If you have 10 lines of code, you'll find 10 issues in the code review. If you have 500 lines of code, it looks fine, ship it. So that's another reason why you should ship small releases. So this is what a big release looks like. Lots of changed lines, lots of commits. It took 6 weeks to write the code in this release, and there are 2 developers involved. Big releases, we don't like them. This is a small release. 1 commit, 1 person involved. And another reason why you want to ship small releases is that when something breaks, and that's the scenario I talked about earlier, somebody ships something and then things start to break. So this is, you can see here a frequency graph of a particular error. Right after we released something, error started to occur. Now, if you have a huge release, it's pretty hard to figure out who might know how to fix this problem. If you have 1 developer that's worked on each release, you can go in and it's probably him who's going to know how to fix it. And so you ask yourself, how does these big releases happen? So what we found was that we've been talking about making small releases. And time after time, we found ourselves with a huge release again. It just happened. So we sat down and tried to figure out how did this happen again, even though we try to keep in mind that we want to do small releases. And it turns out that this is the train of thought that leads to a big release. So you're working on feature A, and your code relies on B. And you think to yourself, B is pretty messy. While I'm at it, let me just refactor B. And that leads to a big release. So when you find yourself thinking, while I'm at it, I'll just stop. What you need to do is to either ship feature A and then refactor B, or refactor B and ship it and then build feature A. And this is something you have to keep in mind. Okay. Now I want to talk about problem-oriented development. It probably has a more academic name, but this is what we call it. And you might know this guy. It's a developer telling you, well, I'm just a developer. You should just tell me how it should work. And here's a variation of that guy, that person. I just did as the spec said. Well, it doesn't solve the problem for the user. Well, it's in the spec. And this is a problem. If you find yourself in a situation where you tell yourself, well, I just did as it says in the spec, then you need to stop for a moment and think about if you're really interested in solving a problem for the end user. So problem-oriented development is about keeping the end user in mind when you're writing some code. Let me show you a screenshot of a spec. So in Opbeat, we decided we wanted to change the timestamps. We wanted to change how we show timestamps to the users. And the product designer wrote out a very nice spec. This is a pretty detailed specification. And Benny, who worked on it, looked at the specification. And you can see that I've highlighted a section of the specification. What it says is, if more than 1 year, include the year as well. Now, there are two ways to interpret this. The first way is if the timestamp we're showing is more than 1 year ago, include the year. The other way to interpret this is if it happened not in the current year, show the year. You understand the difference? So Benny thought to himself, I wonder, I mean, the most obvious interpretation is the first one. If it's more than 1 year ago, that's what it actually says, right? If it's more than 1 year ago, show the year. So Benny went back to the product designer and asked him, what did you actually mean here? What is it that the users are going to understand easiest? And it turns out that it's not the most obvious interpretation of this that the product designer wanted. So we caught it before anybody actually got started coding. And that's an example of caring about the product, caring about the end user, trying to solve it in the best way for him instead of just following whatever it says in the spec. And to take this to a slightly more general level, your organization is made up of all these silos. So you have hard corporations that you hopefully don't do anymore. You have development and web operations in the same kind of silo. But you also have a product department and a customer support department. And there's a lot of talk about DevOps these days. I say, why stop at Dev and Ops? Why don't break down some more silos? That's what I've been talking about. Trying to do more problem-oriented development. So how about you also break down the silo to the product development and to the customer support? Or as I like to call it, DevOps, product dev, customer support. Yeah, so that's actually it. So in summary, you shipped it, you fixed it. If you can increase transparency in the team, you'll have better accountability, and in the end, developers will write better code because they are now being held accountable for the code they write, also when it's in production. You can use tooling to increase transparency and affect the culture in your team. You should be doing small incremental releases. You will be able to ship more and sleep more. You should try to keep your team problem-oriented, to keep them focused on solving problems for the end user and break down silos. And that's going to lead to better products and better solutions. If this was interesting for you, you can go to opbeat.com/blog. We have a lot of blog posts there that will probably be interesting for you. That's it. I have some stickers and like 6 t-shirts with a big coffee pot on it. So if you want one, come and talk to me. And yeah, if you have strong opinions on this, I'd love to talk to you. That's it. Maybe any questions? It's a good question. So the question is, if you, for example, want to move to a new data store, how can you do that in a small release? And it's tough. It isn't everything that you can or that it makes sense to split into small releases. What I would probably do is start writing to the new data store in the background and keep using the old one for the main stuff, and then keeping track of if everything goes correctly. And you can probably roll out that change incrementally. But you're absolutely right that there are things that don't make sense to split into smaller parts.
This is a no-brainer for stuff that shouldn't be visible to the users, but for stuff that is visible to the users. And it's often just the opposite. You keep it stable, and then they roll out a whole bunch of changes at once. Especially for like a look and feel change. You know, you roll out a whole new look. You get press about it and so on. So it's the opposite of what you're saying.
That's true. So I guess what you're saying is that, for example, a huge design change, you want to ship it as a big thing because that is something you can kind of do PR on? Or what is the, maybe I didn't really understand it.
Well, I'm thinking about it as you were talking. I was thinking about it as you were talking. I'm thinking it has something to do with the user visibility.
Right.
So when you're making use, do users really want to sort of get small user visible changes in functionality like every week unannounced, or do they want to, be told about it and get them all at once?
Right. So I think you can still ship things to production without actually changing the interface for users. So we use feature flags, which is very useful. And that means we can enable features for individual customers or individual organizations on our platform incrementally. So we can actually ship it and then not show it to anyone, but it'll still be in production. And then we can slowly enable it for more and more organizations. That's the way to ship things, still shipping small things, and then in one go you can change everybody over to the new design and let them have access to the new stuff immediately. Obviously, if people aren't using your new things, then some of the advantages of shipping small releases goes away, because one of the points with shipping small things is that you get it in the hands of users immediately, and they'll tell you if it's not working for them. So it's a balance, and I definitely think that even with visual changes, users are getting more and more used to things changing over time and not in big, huge releases. And I think we're really seeing a difference in the way users think about this, and it's partly due to the fact that the web changes all the time. And the web is now a platform where you can't ship things to people without them having to download any new software that changes everything for them. But you're right, it's a balance.
So I noticed that you were using Slack as an output. Have you investigated using Slack as an input, like as doing your deploy or talking to your CI or any other stack?
So the question is, we're using Slack as output to the team. Can we, or have we investigated using it as input as well to CI, to deployments, etc.? We've actually recently started using something where we can control PagerDuty from Slack. I think Stripe made it, maybe. But that's pretty useful. So you can put someone else on call directly from Slack, and that works quite well. So the question is, when security is your main concern and you work in a big team, how? So if you, so how do you keep things secure while you're making small incremental releases? I think that shouldn't change. Why would that be different when you're shipping big releases to when you're shipping small releases? I'm not sure that should be different. If you have a security review of your code, you should be doing that for small releases as well as big releases. It might even get even better when you have small releases, because it's much easier to kind of get an overview of a small release, a security overview of a small release, than it is from a big release. Right, so the question is, when you try to get devs involved in some of the other silos, that could lead to a lot of context switching and maybe more inefficiency. Yeah. So that's definitely a concern. And if you take it to the extreme, the typical argument that people have against DevOps is that means that the devs have to do everything. That means nobody's specialized. And I don't think that's true. What you need is a healthy balance. You need the devs to care about the product. You need the devs to care about ops. And that doesn't mean that devs have to do whatever job people in product design do. It just means that they need to understand in detail why we're doing things like this and ask questions when they get a spec specification or requirements thrown at them.
So what you're suggesting is rather than taking on those roles of product development and customer support, there's just one process.
Yeah, and in my opinion, DevOps is also not about developers doing all of the ops work. It's about developers caring about ops and involving themselves in how things work when they get put into production. It's about breaking down the silos so you have more empathy between the departments, more respect between the departments. And that goes for the product department as well. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Do you think DevOps grow from dev or from ops? I mean, this new information, whatever, in your view.
I'm not sure that matters, does it? I mean,
It does.
why does it matter?
Because developers are doing iteration sometimes incredibly horrible results. And the same for operations are doing something for developers, developers reasonable. I don't know, but yeah.
I understand. So what you're saying is that
Yeah, so sometimes developers look like, developers are doing operations, and this is usually right? So,
that can certain.
so what does this strong sector? What was the root, and what was the direction it came from?
Right. I think. So the question is where does this DevOps term come from? Is it operations doing more dev? Is it dev doing more operations? So I think, this is DevOps by now. The term DevOps isn't extremely useful anymore because everybody has their own opinion on what it means. So I think, or at least to me, DevOps just means trying to break down the silos, trying to involve people, or trying to make people care a little bit about what's going on in the other departments. So it's about empathy, it's about respect between the departments. And yeah, if you have, it does happen that you have developers making horrible decisions in ops. It does happen that you have operations people writing horrible code. But I don't think that the DevOps movement or culture is to blame for that. That's just people doing something that they are not really experts in. So the question is, if devs are responsible for shipping code, should they also be responsible for making sure that the migrations that they have written run automatically, or is that a manual process? Right. I think each organization should try out some different things and see what works for them. I can tell you that at Opbeat, the devs are responsible for a lot more than they are in many other organizations, and I think that works to some degree. It also depends on what kind of culture you come from. So if it's an older organization, the operations people will probably be responsible for more things than in newer organizations. So I don't have the golden nuggets when it comes to the exact separation of those things. But I do think that if you give the developers more responsibility, they will write better code. And regarding automation, I can tell you what worked for us. We've automated stuff, but only when we found ourselves doing it over and over again. There's a big push towards automating everything all the time, and I find that oftentimes you find yourself spending a very long time trying to automate something that you could do quickly manually. And I guess it all depends on the frequency of this manual task. So it's a balance. You gotta kind of feel your way through it, in my opinion. That's it, I think. Thank you.